Well, a very warm welcome to this evening's webinar. My name is Adrian Reed at Blackmetric, and I'm really pleased that you were able to make this BA community webinar. And I'm really pleased to say that we're joined this evening by Corrine Thomas of Choices Coaching, who's going to talk about NLP for BAs. Now, I've actually known Corrine I was trying to work this out before the webinar, for probably about 10 years now. In fact, we used to work together for a large financial services organisation, and we've stayed in touch ever since, and in fact have worked together on various projects and even as volunteers for the IIBA UK chapter. Now, I know Corrine has been qualified and interested in NLP for some time, and I was really curious to find out more. So I was really pleased that Corrine agreed to speak to us about NLP. So with a webinar entitled An Introduction to NLP for BAs, I'd like to welcome Corrine Thomas. Corrine, over to you.
Thank you, Adrian, and welcome everybody. Thank you for choosing to spend your next hour with myself and Adrian. Before I get into talking too much about NLP, I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about myself. And as Adrian said, I think we first met around about 10 years ago, but I've actually been working as a business analyst for coming up to 30 years now, but I've not always known I was a business analyst. And I started my career in local government at the time when in the UK we were looking at the community charge, also known as the poll tax. And at that time, my job title was analyst programmer. But I was actually doing a lot of business analysis. We had the government making up regulations that seemed to be on the fly, but not moving the deadline. And I had to sit with my stakeholder and understand the regulations that the government were putting together, understand the systems in local government, which at that time was mainly to do with housing benefits, which is what I was working on. And together we kind of worked out what the regulations were, worked out what business rules we needed, and I went along and updated the system. So I like to think I was working in a very agile way before agile came in. Then later in my career, I went on to work in telecoms and financial services, which is where I first met Adrian. And then my last role within the corporate environment was as head of business analysis for Virgin Media. I now work independently as a coach, a mentor, and a trainer in business analysis, and I also do quite a lot of consultancy. So as to NLP, so how come I got into NLP and what's the relation to business analysis? Well, initially, the NLP came about for a very personal reason. And on the screen on the right-hand side is actually a picture of my elder daughter running the London Marathon about 3 or 4 years ago. But she was actually very poorly as a teenager. And I found out about NLP really from a therapeutic angle initially to help her and work with her. But being a good business analyst and being very curious about things, I wanted to know a bit more about NLP. And I realized that actually it can be applied in a lot of business situations as well as in the personal and in the therapeutic world. And so for me, business analysis, is a growing profession. I think back in my days of the poll tax, the community charge, I was probably working in that system improvement level. And I think this maturity model just shows some of the challenges we have in the profession. But I think as I've moved up in my role, and I don't know if any of you can recognize that, but I think as you're given more authority and the scope of the work we do changes, it becomes more and more difficult. We have lots of interesting challenges from a business perspective. Businesses are very complex these days. Business change is ever growing, ever more things to be looking at. Technology is becoming more complex. The stakeholder environments are complex as well. And there's a lot to learn. And I feel to be a good business analyst, we do need a lot of drive. We have to be confident in what we're doing, and we have to have a very proactive attitude. And for me, this is where NLP comes in. And I think some of the benefits you can get in business analysis from using NLP, things like actually as an individual being better engaged in the work we do, having an increasing level of job satisfaction. We're able to build much better relationships through knowing NLP. NLP actually has 4 pillars which underlie it. And one of those pillars is about building good relationships. And I'll come on to mention a couple of the others as we go through. So I think NLP, initially, when I started to learn it, I began to know a lot more about myself and what my strengths are, what my weaknesses are. And I think that improved self-awareness helped me become better at my job and feel better about my job and become better motivated. It helps with increasing confidence, improved resilience. You know, we're taking people through change. We're going through change a lot ourselves. It can be a hard job. Being able to be resilient to that, I think, is a real benefit. And I think knowing NLP gives us choice and flexibility in handling difficult situations. And flexibility is another of the pillars of NLP. And NLP is very outcome focused. That's one of the other pillars, is about looking at outcomes, which again, as business analysts, we're looking for outcomes and business outcomes. Then another benefit for me is about being more influential, able to challenge. You know, I think if we're more confident, we can challenge from a better place, and it all becomes self-propagating. Then there's lots of tools in NLP, lots of ways for exploring business problems, looking for opportunities. So I said there were some tools in the therapeutic world, but there's lots of tools that you can use to investigate business situations as well. So just to give you a little bit of history of NLP and where it came from, it really began in the 1970s with these two guys are here. So Richard Bandler is the chap at the top of the slide, and John Grinder is at the bottom. But John Grinder was a linguist, and Bandler originally was a mathematician. He was one of Grinder's students, and Grinder decided he wanted to study the three therapists which are listed here, Fritz Perls, Virginia Satir, and Milton Erickson, to see how they got the results they got. And he started with interviewing Milton Erickson, who said, well, I don't know what I do. And he's a hypnotherapist. I just work with people and they get better. I don't really know how I do it. So he said, well, can I just observe you? So he watched him and observed him and then interviewed him to kind of understand how he did what he did. And that's how NLP was born. And it was really about understanding how people get successful results in their lives. And they also went on and looked at, well, how people can be unsuccessful as well. But it was more about how you can be successful. And they both studied human function in quite a structured and systematic manner. And from that, they created the models and the tools that we use today. So NLP, the foundations of NLP is all very much about modeling. It's all very much based on modeling. And we model human behaviors and the way we think, the way we feel, and what we do. And if you think about it, we're all natural modelers. I don't know if there's anybody on the call who has children or are aware of children in their families, but if you watch a child, children learn by modeling and copying what their parents do. And I think a lot of children's toys and games are modeled on things. There's lots of dressing up, pretending to be other things, and that's how young people learn. And if any of you are into sport and you want to learn a new skill, maybe golf or football, you'll be taught the skills that people have learned by watching somebody else. So modeling underpins a lot of what we do. So NLP, what is it? For me, then, it is really, just to sum up, it is a collection of ideas and tools that can help you understand how you experience life. And it allows you to become much more motivated, you can keep a positive frame of mind, and you're better at communicating. So the name is rather long and complicated, so I thought I'd mention a little bit about that. So the neuro really comes from the brain and everything that goes on in our minds. And it does relate to our neurological system and our senses, and how we use our senses to make sense of what's going on around us and how we understand what's going on around us. The linguistic part is all about language and how we use language to interact with the world around us. And that's both our spoken and non-spoken language. So only 7% of our language is actually the words that we say. The other 93% comes from how we say it and from our body language. And that's how we influence people that are around us and how people make sense or understand us. Then the last part of NLP, the programming part is really just about our patterns of behavior, the way that we think, the way that we do things. And again, we all have patterns of behavior. That's what keeps us safe in the world around us. We learn patterns from a very young age. Some of those patterns are helpful for us and some of them aren't. So I don't know how many of you that are on the call run workshops and maybe do presentations. And perhaps you feel slightly nervous or unsure before a big workshop, or perhaps doing a presentation to lots of people. And that is often a pattern that's set up. Once you get nervous once, the body learns, oh, that's my nervous thing. And that will be, then a pattern will set up. For the next time you think, oh, there's a workshop coming up or a presentation coming up, the body will run a pattern of, oh, yes, I need to do my nervousness thing. So you start to get sweaty palms, your heart will beat slightly faster. And that's just a pattern. And once you become aware of that pattern and notice it, should you wish to, you can change it. So I mentioned modeling, and NLP being a lot of it's about modeling. Well, as good business analysts, we like to model systems. We'll often model IT systems, or we may be modeling business systems. So we're looking at a system of interest. We understand all the aspects of it. We might be looking at the different state of it and the interactions between it. And as I was saying earlier, so in NLP, the modeling is about modeling human behavior. So we look at the different aspects of our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. And by looking at all of those three together, we can understand and create a model of things that are going on around us. So this is a model from NLP that really just explains how we think about communication from an NLP perspective. So I'll walk you through this. So starting in the top left, I'm just seeing if my mouse is working. I've got a thing here in a fluffy cloud that's called the world. So for every one of us, the world is around us, and we all experience it slightly differently. There's millions of pieces of information hitting our brains at any one time. We can't deal with all of that consciously. A lot of it we're handling unconsciously, but we filter it down to make sense of what's going on. So we filter using our senses to get things inside our minds, and then we create an internal representation of it. In NLP, we have a number of things that we presuppose to be true, and one of them is we say that the map is not the territory, which basically means the world around us is the territory. The map we create, which is our internal representation, is unique to every one of us. So if any of you are familiar with maps, I've just come back from a walking holiday. I was using a map which represented the world and the mountains around me. And I was with my daughter and she had a map. They were both slightly different because they were made by different providers and they were of different scales. So those maps looked quite different and had different ways of representing the mountain, but they both were representations of the same thing. So for each of us, we use our senses to create our own representation of the world. And we take those things through filters, which here we've called delete, distort, and generalize. And these come from our experiences. There's so much information out there that we will delete bits of information to make sense of it. We'll often distort things. So in our imaginations, we create things. I mean, if any of you like reading books, when you read a book, you'll often imagine what the characters look like and what the surroundings look like. And if that book's ever made into a film, you'll go to the film and think, well, that's not how I imagined it. And that's what distortion's all about. And generalizing is all really about the rules we create about things that happen around us. We'll often say, if you experience something, maybe somebody's late a couple of times for a meeting, you might say, well, that person's always late for meetings. Well, they may not be, it's just that they've been late a couple of times and then you're filtering for it. So that's all generalization is about. It's about the rules we make up. And then inside our heads, we create an internal representation, again, based on our senses. So you may represent in pictures, sounds, your feelings. You may be able to remember a smell or a taste, which will trigger a memory. There's a thing here called self-talk, which is just our internal dialogue, the way we talk to ourselves, how we sort of go along and think about things. All of that impacts our state, in other words, our mood, our feelings. So something out in the world really funny happens and we filter it and think that was funny, we may feel happy and smile and laugh. And there's also a very close association with our physiology. Our body will respond to the way we're feeling. And what the outside world then see is our response or our behavior. So if we start laughing at something, obviously there'll be a smile on our face, our shoulders might move, and someone can see we're laughing. And it may be that they'll laugh too because we're laughing, and that's the result you get. So at a very high level, that is the NLP model of communication. So moving on, I think rapport, that's something that is key to our success as business analysts. You'll often see job specifications and adverts for business analysts, and they'll say you have to be good at rapport, you have to be able to build rapport. And I think it is core for good communications. And often people say, well, what is rapport? How do you define rapport? But really, I think for me, this is what this slide sums up. It's all just about how we connect with other people, how we get on with other people. And good rapport leads to good levels of trust, respect between two people, and high levels of understanding. So these are all things that we want as business analysts. And rapport is something that most of us, or majority of us, will do naturally. We just do rapport. If you meet someone that you've never met before, you will start to build rapport with them. And what you do is you'll look for common ground. We look for common interests. Obviously, if you're a business analyst and we go to an event and you meet someone else who's a business analyst, you've immediately got a connection, something that you can talk about, that you share in common. You might ask somebody where they've come from, where they work, and again, you're looking for something that you can identify that makes them similar to you. So rapport is built naturally, but there are things you can do. I'm sure you can all think of situations where you've met somebody and you're not quite sure and you don't seem to get on with them. You might think, well, actually, they seem to just come from a different place to me. We just don't seem to be able to connect. And it's often because the person we meet is using their senses in a different way to make sense of the world, or they're just coming from a different viewpoint. Their map of the world is very different to ours. That doesn't mean you can't build rapport with them, that you just maybe need to think about it a bit more consciously than you would have done if you've met somebody you naturally build rapport with. So building rapport, really, it's all about, I suppose, actively listening to what someone's saying to you. So although I said words only make up 7% of the communication, the way the words are said and what the words are will help with building rapport. And I think good observation skills is just about noticing the other person's body language. So it's all about noticing what they say, how they're saying it, what's the speed of their voice, what's the tone of their voice, what's their body language telling you. Body language is something that we'll often notice unconsciously. Then it comes more into the conscious mind if there's a difficulty with it. And if you are in rapport with someone, you will often notice, or somebody watching you will notice, that you're in a similar body position. And if you actually actively want to build rapport with someone, you can actively look to either match or mirror their body position. So matching is you'll use exactly the same gesture, mirroring, you kind of mirror back to them. Now, this is something you have to use in small amounts and with respect for the other person, because if you start mimicking them and make it obvious, you will immediately break rapport. So I often think of rapport as being a bit of a dance between two people. You can do it naturally, but if you're actively looking to build rapport with somebody, I think it's initially about just observing them and matching maybe their tone of voice, the speed of voice, and little bits of their body language. If somebody's got their hand on their chin, you can move your hand into a similar position. And what you will notice is, I'm going to come on and talk about the senses and our sensory preferences in a minute, and you can match some of those sensory preferences. So I'll give some tips on things you can look out for when building rapport. So we do use our senses. We've got 5 senses. In a business situation, we tend to talk more about our visual sense, our hearing, and our feelings, also known as our kinesthetic. But taste and smell will come into it as well. But I'm just going to focus on the 3 at the moment. So if someone's got, and we do use all of these senses, and we have different preferences for how we use them in different situations. And over time, by observing people or just noticing your own, you can see what people's preferences are. So someone who's got quite a strong visual preference will often use words saying things like, oh, I see what you're saying, or just imagine this, or I've had a light bulb moment. And it doesn't mean they're only going to use visual words in their speech. It's just that they will use those more often than others. Someone with a very strong visual preference will also talk quite quickly, generally, because they're imagining, they're seeing pictures, and as they see a picture, they will talk through what they can see. They'll often use lots of big gestures with their hands and their arms because they're kind of gesturing what they can see, they're pointing it out, and we unconsciously expect other people to be able to notice what we're seeing when we gesture things. So if you want to build rapport with someone with a very strong visual preference, you can match them with visual words, you can match their tone and speed of voice, and you can actually not completely match their gestures, but you can sort of recognize the gestures and to mirror some of the things they're doing. So if somebody's got a stronger hearing sense, they're using their auditory sense more, they will say things like, I hear what you're saying, sounds good to me, that's music to my ears. Their tone of voice is often more rhythmic and melodic, and you will sometimes see somebody using an auditory sense tilt their head slightly to one side or the other. That can be a very subtle thing. You may not pick it up immediately, but just notice what they're saying. And the other one, the sort of the kinesthetic sense or the feeling, someone who's very strongly kinesthetic will use words around, oh, it's comfortable, I'm getting a grip of this. But their voice tone tends to be slower, because if you think about it, to connect with your feelings, you have to almost go inside to your body, notice the feeling, and then you come back. So somebody with a strong kinesthetic preference will often be the last to respond, and they will speak slower, and they will take their time to answer you. So you can imagine if you're in a workshop, you're working with a group of people, if you've got somebody with a very strong visual preference and someone with a very strong kinesthetic preference in the same room at the same time, they can find it quite difficult to get on with each other. If you're the facilitator of a workshop and you don't know all these people, you have to think about using different styles at different times of the workshop. And for many of you, have you ever been on a workshop or a training course and after lunch you have that after lunch slump? Well, that's because we've eaten, our body's gone into quite a kinesthetic mode, it's busy digesting the food, so we'll often sit slumped in our chairs, which does make us more kinesthetic, quieter, sleepier. So if you're the facilitator, if you're the BA up there needing to get people energized, get them up doing an exercise, get them looking up at the walls, because then you'll move people into more of a visual sense. That's where the models and things that we use can be really, really useful. So that's a little bit about rapport and rapport building. What I'm going to talk to you about now is something called the thinking patterns, or our meta programs. Now, these meta programs are actually also known as deletion filters. So if you think back to the NLP communication model I showed you, and I'm saying when we make sense of the world around us, we delete things. The meta programs are one of the ways that we delete things. And again, they're just thinking patterns. And the reason that we have them, again, I suppose, is to set up habits so we don't have to consciously think about everything we're doing. Now, our deletion filters, or the meta programs, are all about where we put our attention, where our habitual patterns of thinking are, how we make our decisions, how we behave. And there's been over 60 of these patterns observed so far, and probably more of them being thought about all the time. One of the easiest ways to break rapport with someone is to mismatch their thinking patterns. And today, because we've only short of time, I'm just going to take you through 3 patterns to give you a flavor of them. We tend to think about them on sliding scales. So I'll show you the first one because it's easier to show you to give an example. So this pattern is all about how we motivate ourselves. And we can be on one end or the other end, or we can be somewhere in between. And as I talk about these, I think as business analysts, we have to flex between both ends of them. We'll probably have a preference individually, and they can be quite situation specific. But this one is really about how we motivate ourselves. So just to explain it, if you have a think, if you're somebody that maybe when the alarm goes off in the morning, you leap out of bed, you're looking forward to what lies ahead in the day, you're looking forward to what you'll be able to achieve when the day goes on, you've probably got quite a strong towards preference. You tend to focus on the goals, what you need to achieve, what's coming up, what are you looking forward to. But on the other hand, if your alarm goes off and you hit the snooze button, you want a bit more time in bed. You're a bit, well, I don't want to get up. I'm not going to get up until the last minute. I'm not going to get till somebody forces me to. You've probably got a bit more of an away preference. And that doesn't mean to say we're always in one and we're always in the other, but over time you may notice that you've got a stronger preference for one or the other. And I'll give you an example of a business situation where I came across this in my career. I had a friend who had a very strong towards preference. She was very goal focused, very achievement focused, loved ideas, loved getting things done. She was a great person to have on your team when you're shaping a new project, you're scoping it, looking towards what can be done. And she was getting very frustrated. She'd moved into a new role. She had a manager, and he just didn't seem to understand her ideas. Everything she went to him with, she said, he just pours cold water on everything I say. He just picks holes in everything I say, everything I do. And what it was is she was highly towards, and she was giving him all the goals, all her thoughts, all her ideas, but he had a very strong away from preference. So he wanted to know everything that could go wrong, what things they needed to avoid, and all the things that could get in the way before he would agree to doing something. And it didn't mean he didn't share her enthusiasm for doing something new. It's just he wanted to make sure all the blockers were out the way first. So as you can see, once they both understood each preference, they worked out how to work together. She would come up with an idea, she'd run it past him, he'd come up with all the this could go wrong, that could go wrong, what might happen. Then they could work out scenarios to deal with that. Then they had a way forward. So that's towards and away from. The next one I'm going to talk about is really about information and information chunks. What are you comfortable with dealing with? And this one, I think as business analysts, we have to be able to flex between both ends of this spectrum. But it'd be interesting to see where you might be comfortable. When I looked at this, I'm thinking, well, earlier in my career, when I was back in the local government, and I actually was an analyst and a programmer, I think I was probably down at the specific end. I was quite good at looking into all the detail, working out what needed to be done. But then further on in my career, I've had to learn to work at more of an overview level and a bigger level. So if you do have a preference for the general end of this spectrum, you tend to work in what I call big picture items. You do see the big picture, the grand vision, where things want to go. You're not fazed by interruptions. If someone has got quite a general preference and they'll talk to you, they will often give you random ideas. They're often short sentences. They won't give a lot of detail behind it, but they just give you the overview. The other end of it is someone who likes lots of detail. They want to know all the ins and outs of something. If you ask them to talk to you about a project, they will probably give you everything involved in it in quite a long and detailed story about what happens and when and who's doing what. So it's very precise. They'll give you lots of step-by-step information about how things happen, which is great if you're asking or want a project update. But sometimes you only want a summary of what's going on, not all the detail. And I'm sure as I'm talking, you may be able to think of examples of times when you've come across people at either end of the spectrum. And again, if you've got someone with a very general preference with someone with a detailed preference or specific preference, they can get quite frustrated with each other because the specific person wants more detail. The general person is getting bored after about 5 or 10 minutes and wants to move on. And then another meta program, which I think is worth talking about, is this one, and it's all about what we're drawn to, what we're interested in. Is our preference for tasks and processes and systems and things, or is it more to do with relationships and people and how people get on together? And again, as a business analyst, I think we need to be able to handle both ends of this spectrum. We're looking at the tasks that need to be done, the systems that need to be changed, the things that need to happen, but also we've got to take people on a journey with us. And if we have a strong preference for one end of this, it can be quite difficult and stressful to go to the other end. So what NLP does is give you tools to help think about your own preferences and then how you might want to move to the other end. So if you're working with somebody and you put forward a task or something that needs to be done or a change that needs to happen, if they talk to you a lot about who's impacted and all the people on their team and who does what in the team and why it's going to be good for them or bad for them, you probably find they've got quite a relationship focus. And if you're talking to them about what they do and they give you all the what's and the tasks and all that kind of thing, then they're probably more task focused. And again, different situations, people may change. So that's just a snippet of the meta programs, and there's many more that you can look up and read about and hear about. But those are 3 that I think are quite easy to observe and are very pertinent to our work as business analysts. So coming back to the rapport, if you can meet somebody where their preference is, then it's much better and easier to build rapport with them. If you're using language that they're comfortable with, and they will then respond to you in a much better way. So the last thing I'm going to cover and is a tool that's sometimes called different viewpoints. It's sometimes known as different perspectives. And this is something that's very easy to do and pick up and use, but it can be very powerful. And you can do it just by sitting and thinking, or you can actually move yourself around the room. And the way it works is all about taking 3 different perspectives on things that happen. And the reason I've shown a slide here with a pair of shoes is sometimes known as walking in someone else's shoes. So if you're about to maybe run a workshop, or you're having a meeting with somebody and you're not sure how it's going to go, you can rehearse it. Or maybe you've had a difficult conversation that hasn't gone well, you can reflect back on it using the different perspectives to see what you can learn from it. So the perspectives that you take when you're using different perspectives, the first one is you're looking at it from your own perspective. And in NLP, we talk about it as like viewing it through our own eyes. So it's thinking about your own views of the situation and your knowledge about yourself to think about, well, what went well then? What didn't go so well? How could I do it differently in the future? If I'm planning for a workshop, what outcome is it I want from that workshop? How do I want it to run? How am I going to behave? What do I need to do to make sure I'm facilitating at my best? What are the techniques I'm going to use to bring out the best in others, but also be the best I can be? The second perspective, and this is the one that really relates to stepping into somebody else's shoes, is really putting yourself in their position. So if you've had a difficult conversation, or if you've got a difficult conversation coming up, you use your imagination and your thought process to think about what it's going to be like from that other person's viewpoint. What is it they're going to be thinking about? What are they going to see from me? So if I'm looking like I'm nervous and unsure and unconfident, they're going to pick that up. So I need to make sure I come across in a confident way. Maybe if you're running a workshop and you've got different stakeholders coming in, if you know a little bit about them, how are they going to be in the workshop? Are they going to be the ones that are awkward or difficult? What is it I need to tell them so they come to the workshop prepared? What do I know about their different styles and how they approach things to be able to make the workshop right for them when they come along? Then the third perspective is often known as a neutral one or a detached one, and is often as known as the fly on the wall position. This is about taking the viewpoint of an independent observer. So if somebody was watching a conversation between you and somebody else, what would they be able to see? What body language might they notice? What body language would you like to achieve if you're having a difficult conversation with somebody? What could they hear? Can they hear raised voices? All that kind of thing. So somebody came in to your ideal workshop and watched it happening. What would you like them to be able to see? Is it everybody interacting? Are people taking part? Are there good discussions taking place? All that kind of thing. So sitting here now talking about it, it's one of those techniques from NLP that's easy to talk about and sounds very simple, but it's actually very powerful. And you can make it more powerful by sometimes actually positioning yourself in different places within a room. And you can often sit in a different chair and pretend to be someone else. So it all sounds a bit funny, but it does have a lot of benefits. It's amazing how much we can pick up about somebody else unconsciously, because all it's doing is trying to connect in with that unconscious information you've picked up from being with somebody else. And you can use that to prepare for things that are coming up. So that's a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of NLP. There's lots to it, lots of different techniques. And I think if you want to know more, if you're interested in it, I think begin with yourself. Just notice some of your patterns. Notice where your preferences are. Have a think about what motivates you. How do you use your senses? Do you have any preferences? Are you quite visual? Are you perhaps kinesthetic? Are they different in different situations? When I've got on here, how do you put up barriers to your success? Sometimes that's about, well, how do you stop yourself? Because you can often get into a pattern of, well, I'm not very good at that, so I won't do it. And I've heard business analysts come to me when I was running teams sometimes going, well, I find this technique difficult, so I don't think I'll use it. And once you've got into a pattern of it's difficult, I can't do it, sometimes it's tricky to get over that. Or I can't get on with that stakeholder, I always find them difficult. You've created that general rule about somebody. So it's just noticing some of those things and thinking about it differently. But notice what things you do well, celebrate what you're good at and get better at it. And often think about, well, how do you think about your goals? Are you very towards? Are you away from? How would you like to express your goals? So that's enough of me talking. I'm just wondering now if there's anybody on the call that has any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Corrine, for a really, really interesting and rich overview. It's amazing to get so much across in just sort of 30 or 40 minutes. So everyone on the call, please do feel free to type any questions that you have into the question box. I see we have a number of questions coming through already, which is fantastic. So we'll answer as many as we can in the remaining 20 or so minutes. So feel free to type additional questions in as we go along. So Corrine, the first question we have is about rapport, and I'll paraphrase it because it's a little bit long, but essentially the question is around if there is, if you're dealing with someone where there's like bad rapport, so where there's perhaps a history of not getting along, is it possible to regain rapport, or what tips would you have if there's a difficult relationship that exists with a stakeholder?
Yeah, I mean, it can be. I think what I would do, and I have to say I've been in those situations. I think it's very easy to get into a pattern with someone and think, actually, I can't get on with them. We just don't seem to be able to build rapport, and there can be all sorts of reasons why that's happened. And I think, for me, the first thing is almost put everything to one side and just do what we do when we're thinking about systems and IT. Just be curious. Just notice. If you get the opportunity to just notice and observe the other person, see if you can find something that is common. And I think the challenge will be if you've got into a bad rapport situation, that both people will have got into a habit and a pattern of how they interact with each other, and it's down to you as an individual to break that pattern. So maybe look for something where maybe you can approach them differently, speak to them slightly differently, look for something where you can make a connection. It's not always easy, but I would say take small steps at a time. Look for one thing you might be able to find in common, one shared interest or some connection. Then you can start rebuilding rapport, but do it in very small steps, one at a time.
Fantastic. So small steps, and that actually, Corrine, leads really nicely into the next question, which is also related to rapport. And the question is specifically around empathy versus rapport. And so the question is rapport, are rapport and empathy the same things, or are they different somehow?
That's a very good question.
It's a tricky one, isn't it?
I think there's some, and again, I'm only going to give my view of the world. Obviously, people can agree or disagree. I think the thing that's similar for me, I think empathy is about understanding someone else and where they're coming from, and I think rapport is about that as well. I suppose the difference maybe is what you do with it, because I think empathy, they're both around getting an understanding of the other person. So I think empathy, you will often say, well, I need to understand where they're coming from. I think you need good rapport to be able to build empathy. So that's my initial thoughts. I don't know if that helps.
Definitely, that
But I
sounds.
think they are similar. But I suppose rapport, for me, the rapport and some of the things in NLP helps you to almost systematically break things down. I think building rapport will enable you to have a good level of empathy with someone else and understand where they're coming from and maybe why.
Yeah, so perhaps a different lens, perhaps they're different lenses on a similar sort of topic. But
I think so, yes.
mm. Okay, we've got quite a few questions coming in actually on rapport. Another question is around rapport specifically in a workshop environment. And the question, again, it's a little bit, I'll truncate it a little bit, but it's essentially around, and we've probably all been there, when you're running a workshop with people who perhaps you've never met before, or some of them you've never met before, or you don't know them very well. And actually, is there a way of using a workshop as a way of building rapport with with stakeholders that we're gonna need to work with?
Yes, you can. And I mean, I've talked about rapport really on a one-on-one, and I suppose one-on-one is an ideal situation. But if you're running a workshop and you've got people coming you've never met before, and that will often, as when we work as trainers, that often happens. I'm given a list of people. I don't know till those people walk in the room what they're like, who they are. Um, and it's the same if you're running a workshop. And I think some of the key things to do, as people come in, if you can, is about greeting them, making a connection with them as when the workshop starts, trying to remember people's names, which isn't always easy to start with, but actually saying people's names out loud. So if someone comes in and goes, "Hi, I'm Tom," you go, "Hello, Tom, it's nice to meet you." Having that said out loud, you'll find you remember someone's name much, much quicker. And by remembering someone's name, I don't know if you've ever been on the receiving end. If you've been somewhere and someone remembers your name, you go, "Oh, yes, I quite like this." It's just a recognition. So that's a small thing. We often have icebreakers in workshops to help people get to know each other. those are largely rapport building. I know some people think, oh, I hate those, that you just go around the room and you have to say something about yourself, and I hate it. But if you can make them something small and something fun, it helps to build rapport. And you may notice as a workshop goes, so if you don't know people, you don't know their preferences, my suggestion is to have a mixture of exercises or things that people do. So in workshops as business analysts, we'll often use brainstorming exercises, we'll often use post-it notes. So use lots of, visual things. I think the thing with post-it notes, you can use them for all sorts of things. You can get people standing up, moving around the room and putting things on walls. People, again, I'm going into a different thing, but people who are activists and doers love that. But people with a strong visual preference will often like that kind of thing as well. But
Yeah,
also, if you get people writing notes down on post-its before they put them up, it does give people who need longer to think, who maybe have a more kinesthetic preference.
that
Kind of,
actually, sorry to interrupt, Corrine, but
that's
that actually
fine.
leads really nicely onto one of the other questions, and where someone says that in their last workshop they had somebody who had a kinesthetic preference who was taking a lot longer compared with others, and they were finding they were being cut off, and they
Yeah.
were wondering whether there's a good way of allowing people with a kinesthetic preference to answer, but they say without shining the spotlight on them, which would potentially make them uncomfortable. So would you suggest post-it notes, or are there other approaches you'd suggest, Corrine?
Um, I think post-it notes, but I think it's, the skill is with the facilitator is noticing, and I think it's, great for the person that asked the question. They've actually noticed it, that, we are all different. People with a strong visual preference, you get a picture in your mind and you quite happily would chat about it. Other people take longer to connect. So just notice and maybe bring them in. I mean, people will often, and this is where it comes to the body language, because people will often give you cues through their body language when they are ready to engage. So someone who's kinesthetic and has a strong kinesthetic preference will often look down and away from you when they're processing. But when they're ready to contribute, they will look to catch your eye, or they might put a gesture with their hand to show that they're wanting to. And a lot of this stuff we do pick up unconsciously, but I think as a facilitator for a workshop, it's about noticing some of these. And you can notice if you have a workshop of people who are beginning to work well together, you can have what's known as group rapport. You will notice people start to match body language around a room. So you're probably all going to go away and start watching each other in workshops. It can be quite fun, but don't spend too much time with it. But you will notice a group that are working well together will start to adopt similar postures.
Definitely, definitely. And in fact, the person who asked that question's added a sort of a bit of a clarification or an addendum, which is another probably quite a tricky point, but an interesting one to put you on the spot a little bit.
Oh, thank you.
But they were essentially saying that they were on a conference call. So what about building rapport and considering different representation styles on a conference call? That's a tricky one, I guess, Corrine.
It is very tricky because, I said that a large amount of communication is non-verbal. So you've immediately taken away the observation of people's body language that you can see. So you're restricted on a conference call to the words people are using, and then tuning in to the tone of voice. And it can be really, really tricky. But there is more you can pick up through tone of voice than you might think you can. And I suppose it's really just, for me, I have a very strong visual preference. So if I'm on a conference call, I will draw in front of me a sort of impression of a desk and where people might be sitting to help me remember who's effectively in the virtual room. And if you're the person that's facilitating, I think it's about trying to draw everybody in. The challenge when you're not face to face is you don't know the right time to bring someone in because you don't have those cues. And it can be really easy to lose people. But I think you have to I think you have to be a lot more, what's the word, structured in actually going around the virtual room and asking people if they'd like to if they'd like to say something. in a way that doesn't put them on the spot, because some people might just say, no, I'm happy, I'm listening, but other people will find it, because you haven't got the visual cues of when to come in and say something. Some people just don't get a chance to say anything, and they may not want to, but actually stopping every now and again and just saying, I'm just going to check in around the room if there's anybody who wants to speak, or just going round, it gives people the option.
That's right, and I mean absolutely, and I mean an idea I'd throw in, Corrine, is even if it's possible just to have some form of shared workspace where people can, if they're not talking, they can just put a part, like a visual car park. Sometimes, I don't know if you've ever tried
Yeah,
using that, but those sorts of things enable people to just like dump an idea so that they know it's not lost. So
yeah.
other technology as well. So brilliant. Okay, another quite tricky question, Corrine, but I think a really good one. And the person, first of all, starts by saying that they think it's an excellent summary of NLP, which I think we'd all agree with. And they say
Thank
that
you.
any considerations or risks regarding gaining rapport in multicultural groups.
Oh, yes, that is that is challenging. I think you've got to just be aware, and sometimes this comes through experience of just different cultural things, because I'm trying to think. I've worked across different cultures, and it's very different. I think there's some very basic stuff of people will look. You can use a lot of the things to make a connection with people. If you're running a workshop with people from different cultures, you're there for a reason. Let's talk about the business reasons. Some of the body language things and the eye contact things can be tricky, because some cultures eye contact is, different lengths of eye contact are considered to be different. And you can go on and training courses and courses that teach you all about different cultures and how to approach different cultures. In my experience, I think there is a dose of common sense. you you kind of have to build respect by getting to know people a little bit. In certain cultures, eye contact is not considered to be good. Some people don't shake hands, some people do. It's a really tricky one, actually. I think you just have to notice, you notice people as individuals first, and then if you do know of any cultural things just through experience or chatting to other people that you need to be careful of, then I think you just need to be mindful of those.
Absolutely. Again, just a potential tip to throw in that may be of interest to some people, but there's I mean, I can never pronounce the name correctly. It's either Geert Hofstede or Hofstede,
Oh
but
yeah.
there's a Hofstede Institute which has continued Hofstede's work,
Mm.
and there are various cultural dimensions, and there's stuff online that you can look at, and you can put in a particular national culture and see how it tends to rate on particular dimensions. And I've found this really
Mm.
useful to look at, say, British culture, and
Yeah,
and you find that actually as communicators we're really indirect, and
we are.
but you're never aware of that until you start working internationally. So
No, I think for me, I think the thing I would say is if you're going into a room with people, in with an international audience, if you have the opportunity, just observe first. And I know you can't always do that, especially if you're leading it, but just observe the response you get from people. And if you're not getting a good response, just alter what you do. Because you're right, the British, we tend to be quite indirect. Other cultures will be very direct. And sometimes we don't, as Brits, oh, I don't like that. Then if you step back and go, actually, that might just be their culture, the way they are, then that's fine.
absolutely,
I
absolutely.
experienced it back I worked for a very large telecoms company that grew massively, and we did go global, and we had people coming in from Germany, Italy, Spain, and they had very different approaches to how you run workshops. And I think don't underestimate, if you're bringing people together from different cultures for the first time, don't underestimate how much time you need just to allow people to get used to each other and the different ways. And I think one of the presuppositions we have in NLP is, if you think about everybody has a positive intention to their behavior. It helps make it easier to manage and build rapport with somebody.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So, probably time for a couple more questions. A very
Mm.
helpful comment from a participant on the webinar as well around national cultures, and that they've suggested don't forget Charles Hampden Turner, saying they find that work personally more helpful than Hofstede. So thank you very much. That's one that's definitely worth looking up as well. So next question, somebody asks, they say in their last workshop they had a very difficult participant that was only happy when they were talking about their own solutions rather than the topic, and shut everyone down if they tried to redirect. Gosh, I bet we've all had that one.
Yes.
Any ideas on how to engage with them? Again, another tricky question, but quite a common one.
Oh, so just talking about their own viewpoint,
Yeah, their own pet
pet
solution.
solution. It's not easy. It's not easy. I think sometimes it's about hearing what someone has to say, and then sometimes you do have to kind of, with respect, shut them down or ask them. It's about bringing others in, I suppose, allowing others to have a say. Let it be known that we've heard, it's really interesting, you've made a point, but we do need to move on to something else. You can use, so I've talked a lot in the rapport thing about matching and mirroring to build rapport. You can actually, and it's about respectfully breaking rapport with that person, because they're going to dominate the workshop, continually talk about their own pet subject. It is almost sometimes about using some of the things to break rapport. One of the most difficult situations I've been in with someone like that, I have actually used a short break in the workshop because it has got to the point where nobody else is able to engage. So you break the flow, have a break. If you need to, you can speak to them individually. Sometimes that breaks it enough that you can move on.
Definitely.
And sometimes you can use gestures to just break rather than matching body language continually, matching voice tone. You can use subtly different voice tones to actually give the message, actually, right, thank you, I've heard you, really interesting point, now we need to move on to someone else. So I think for me it's about using respectful interactions first. If that doesn't work, it's about taking a break in the workshop and having a conversation one-on-one.
Fantastic, brilliant, some really useful tips there, and probably time for just one question remaining. But Corrine, I'm going to ask you to answer in sort of like 45 seconds or less. If you can.
Okay.
I know it's always a tricky one, and it's a big question as well. But the question is, how can you overcome a lack of trust using NLP? Any tips appreciated?
Oh gosh, a lack of trust. I think it's just trying to meet that person in their map of the world if you can. And see if you can get underneath it as to where the lack of trust come from. Because it may not be anything to do with you, it might be something else that's kind of made them untrusted. Do they not trust any BAs? Is it a specific thing? So I think, try and engage with them, trying to understand their map of the world and where they're coming from.
Fantastic, excellent advice there. So Corrine, before we move on and close, and I've just got details of our next webinar, which I'll share with everyone before we close. But Corrine, if people want to stay in touch with you, if they've got additional questions, how's the best way for people to connect with you?
So obviously my actual company name is called Choices Coaching. So my email is Corrine, which is CORRINE at choices-coaching.co.uk. You can also get hold of me through LinkedIn. Very happy to answer any questions through either of those channels, really.
Fantastic. Well, all that's left is for me to say a massive thank you, Corrine, for joining us this evening. It's been a really rich and interesting session. I'm sure we've all learned a great deal. Also, thank you everyone for dialing in. This was a bit of an experiment as a first webinar, but the plan is really to run a series of BA community webinars on a whole range of different subjects. So our next webinar is scheduled for the 11th of September, and Nick Devoyle will be joining us to talk about user experience fundamentals. So that's one to take a look at in your diary. And in fact, when you close down the webinar, there's a link to, you'll be directed to a link to register immediately. So although we haven't quite got the abstract together for that, if you do want to reserve your place, please do go ahead. Also, I'll be emailing out a very short survey, literally just 3 questions. It will take you no more than 2 minutes to complete that. We'd be really grateful if you could complete that and let us know how you found the webinar, but also whether there are any topics you'd like to see covered in future, because we'll try and do that if there are particular topics that you like. So massive thank you again to Corrine. Very good evening to everyone on the line. Have a fantastic evening and hope to see you on the next webinar. So bye for now.